Hi, this is David Gornoski, host of A Neighbor's Choice and Things Hidden podcast, as well as some of our other programs like Science and You with our chief science advisor, Dr. Yu, and our seed oil survival series that we continue to have great fun unpacking the truth of nutrition. I wanted to give you a quick little message saying we appreciate all the support that we get from our uh, monthly contributors and our one-time donation supporters. And we'd encourage all of you to go to our website, a neighborschoice.com, click on contribute, and make a monthly pledge today, whether it's $1, $5, 15, 20, 50, whatever you want to do. Doesn't matter. Just be a part of building this new media project that we've developed to empower and inform, to inspire, to kickstart a scientific renaissance, an anthropological breakthrough and reformation in the church. All these things are possible with your support right now. So make that commitment today and help us keep doing the productions that we have. Thank you. So we did a episode recently where I just did through a monologue where I talked about the different references to stones, cornerstones, capstones, all these different stones within the biblical anthology. And a lot of people had questions, um, comments, seemed to stir up some great discussion. Multiple programs reached out, wanted to interview about that topic and others. So that was great. But I wanted to have some chance to kind of unpack some of the common questions that audiences may still have about these themes. And so to do so, I have with us a returning guest, editor at aneighborschoice.com, Surit Dasgupta. How you doing, sir?
Hey, I'm doing fine. How are you doing?
Doing good. So what are some of the questions that pop out to you, just and not just necessarily questions you may have or questions people may have about some of these cornerstone and capstone motifs that we see in scripture? The text that is the most famous, of course, is the stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. Sometimes it's translated as that, but sometimes it's translated as the head of the corner, which is more in keeping with the capstone. Capstone being the last stone that you would place on the structure that you're building. With everything we're looking at here, Jesus is a carpenter in the popular imagination, perhaps a stonemason. We're told to build a living temple of our lives as living sacrifices in history. The Bible begins with a garden, it ends in a city. Jesus says, "In my Father's house are many mansions." The word mansions translated there seems to indicate inns. So the idea that we're going to heaven as our final destination is kind of challenged by this. When you think of inns, it's like a motel, it's a hotel, it's a temporary place where you're staying on a journey, and that journey is to remake the world. So that would seem to indicate that life after death is not the final story in the Jesus Project, which would orient us away from a kind of pious detachment from the world and towards an engagement with the world in light of that, right?
Yeah, I think you're right. And well, what you basically were doing is you were bringing biblical archaeology and anthropology together. And seldom have Christians ever explored the anthropological side of Jesus's teachings and the anthropological implications of what he was preaching. So, like, you brought up these wonderful motifs that Jesus would time and again reference, and these motifs, of course, they had more to do with stones. So, yeah, I think it was all fascinating, and I think it has. I'm glad that it is being brought into the Christian conversation, because we hardly, like I said, we hardly go into this thing, and we prefer to stick to the basics, like the very, bare bones basics, and we don't build on it. That's the most important thing. I think we need to build on these basics that we are often taught in catechesis, or Bible studies and so on. And the fact that we're not willing to build on it, it sort of betrays our insecurity in the face of the modern world. And it sort of like betrays our lack of confidence that the gospel does not provide any solution to what we're seeing all around us in the world of media, politics, and even ph- uh, big pharma, and all of these things. We're just just mm, barely willing to take it on.
Yeah, that's interesting that folks have still they find a fascination with anthropology, but they don't want to interact with theology. It's kind of like something you keep over there and talk about a strange new burial mound was found in the Aztec region where they used to do human sacrifices, but it's always an oddity that can't engage with uh, the theology found in the Bible. And I think that has to stop. If we're going to move past the kind of disruption between heaven and earth that our culture reflects, right? Is a lack of incarnational reality leavening the way we think of the world, uh, a kind of detachment, a kind of two-tier approach to thinking of things, where there's the way of Jesus, turning the other cheek has nothing to do with Bible verses. I've heard that said so many times. Excuse me, turning the cheek has nothing to do with politics. Don't ever let that touch my politics. I've heard heartfelt Christians tell me, and I think to myself, my goodness, where are they getting this from? Where are they getting that from?
Well, I was recently watching a debate between an Orthodox Christian and a Catholic Christian. And the argument was why we need this specific image of God to make sense of the world. And the most interesting thing is, I didn't hear any argument of why we need the Christian God. Even though there were two Christians debating, I didn't hear any argument of why we need the Christian God to make sense of the world, and how the Christian God offers a solution to what we're seeing in the world. And I think, in order to do that, we need to explore the anthropology that Jesus presents, because the Bible, as you've mentioned in previous conversations, the Bible reads us, and it teaches us how human interactions work, and uh, we need to observe these truths, and we need to study them further. They're rarely given a chance in academia. They're rarely given a chance in Bible study, or Christian churches. And I think Christians need to really explore that. So one of the questions that came into my mind when you were referencing Jesus's triumphant entry into Jerusalem, where he said that, where he rebuked the Pharisees, and he said that if these people should become silent, the stone themselves will cry out from the foundations of the city. So you said that it referenced immurement. I would really like you to get more deep into that, uh, to see whether the because a lot of people, when they when they study the Old Testament, they think like the ancient Israelites were like, very Christian kind of nation. But people often miss the point that the Old Testament explores sacrificial violence from both ways, from the perspective of the crowd and also from the perspective of the victim. And what I mean by that is it offers us like how crowds justify violence, right? They say like, oh no, these people, they commit all kind of atrocious sins, therefore they are ripe for genocide, right? It's always like placing the blame on the other tribe, instead of like seeking to rehabilitate them. And we can see this in the accounts of the extermination of the Canaanites, which is a very controversial topic, whether Christians want to admit it or not. It's a controversial topic. It really uh, places the Christian in a conundrum. Like, why would God command the genocide, or the extermination of other peoples, so that the ancient Israelites can take over their land and build a city for them, and on to juxtapose, to balance that out, the Old Testament also gives us the account of Jonah, who God, in his case, God does not exterminate Nineveh, but listens to their repentance and forgives them. So I thought that was an interesting area to go into. So it's very like a topic filled with landmines, but I
So
think I
Jonah as a character would read a lot of the folks today, right? Jonah, remember the Bible reads us, right? So Jonah reads the heart of the Christian who doesn't want to embrace the nonviolence of Christ, right? He's unhappy with the salvation of the Ninevites in that story. He's very unhappy that these wicked people who were filled with people doing heinous things like a Jeffrey Epstein times 1,000, brutality, horrible stuff in the Ninevites. And the idea, some historians have questioned whether, there was any evidence of a great repentance towards, and turning towards the Yahweh way in the Nineveh area during that time period. But even if it didn't happen, it stands as a kind of like like in a literal sense, this was a popular piece of literature that challenged the haughty spirit that governed that culture. That's why it was a kind of prophetic text. It's a like how today's stand-up comedians say the thing that you're not allowed to say. So whoever the author of Jonah is saying the thing you're not allowed to say by roasting, this is a character who in a previous text is seen as a warrior, and all of a sudden in this text he's complaining and whining about bringing mercy to this group of wicked people that deserve to burn, in the sense of like the Joker. Well, they're not in that sense, but the Joker nihilism of let it all burn, that kind of mindset of they don't deserve grace. They don't deserve mercy. And that spirit of haughtiness is satirized a little bit in that story near the end there, where, God is trolling him a little bit with the caterpillar eating his little tree and leaving him in the scorched sun, and that whole story is demonstrating that spirit that we still are plagued by to this day. Just like everything you see has like a three-dimensional aspect to it. Like when you approach the passion, that's approaching one of the pivotal aspects of the gospel event as it impacts the Christian today. So of course you're going to see issues like Peter saying, "Don't say you're going to go to the cross. Let it not be, Lord," because we in our spirit still say that to this day, right? We in our spirit still say, "I want a macho machismo fake Jesus," like Peter wanted. I'll take Jesus here and then I'll vote for this person here to use force to subdue my enemy. We don't believe in the way of nonviolence because we can point to half-baked, cheap rip-offs of nonviolence here or there, and then we use that as an example to say Jesus' way doesn't work. But faithfulness to Jesus means trusting that his way is the way of the world, that his way opens up the path to dominion. So important to connect nonviolence of Christ with the dominion mandate that's restored by Christ taking on the place of the new Adam. Adam failed in his attempt at dominion because he was so drawn into envy that he was trying to imitate God in a rivalrous way. Jesus imitates God in a non-rivalrous, non-violent way, which opens up the path for the dominion mandate to be restored non-violently. Like elemental transmutation to get your rare earths instead of blowing up mines. Blowing up mines and having wars to over access to who has access to a mine is a violent kingdom of Satan approach to mine to rare earth elements that can be used versus a non-violent solution like transmutation at room temperature to get gold out of trash. That's a technology Americans and Christians around the world could explore, but they're too caught up in resentments. They're too caught up in the fashions of their time, the spirit of their age, that they'd rather have a hero with force. Just like Peter, he'd rather stab somebody than do it the nonviolent way because he didn't have enough trust at the time in that being a way that could succeed.
I want to contrast what Jesus, his earthly life, and like people say it was an ancient time, but it's so similar to the time that we're living in many ways. And I was wondering what your opinion on that would be. So Jesus, when he confronted the Pharisees during his time, and the Pharisees, these were people who were like real rigid, traditional keepers. Like they wanted to keep the traditions, and they wanted to keep it to the jot. Like they didn't want to, like they didn't want any flexibility at all. So Jesus was challenging them, and I think you also referenced this in your previous videos. He was challenging the Pharisees, the scribes, and by saying that and not just the Pharisees, he was challenging people in general, and he challenged them by saying that you say that if the prophets would live in our time, we would honor them, but by saying this, and correct me if I'm wrong because I'm trying to paraphrase this, by saying this, you are admitting that you have descended from those who have slain the prophets. Is that correct? Did he say it like that?
Basically, like, you were saying if you were in the days of your ancestors, you would not have partaken of the slaughtering of the
Yeah.
prophets, the blood of the prophets.
Yes, right. So the reason why I'm bringing that up is because I think it goes perfectly with what you said about institutions being built, or institutions, or like, or not just institutions, just a way of life being built on sacrificial violence. And in Jesus' time, that sacrificial violence was the prophets who were slain by the kings whom they did not agree with, or like or the enemies of, or by the people by the ancient Israelites themselves. So this really brings this point home in that things that are built on bloodshed aren't really meant to last, are they? So
Yeah.
like they crumble down very easily when you have someone like Jesus really questioning the foundation. And really it was Jesus who was the pioneer of it all. He started it all. And we are seeing the same spirit, whether it's from the left or whether it's from the right. challenging the institutions, the many institutions that are really struggling to stay afloat in modern day politics or whatever, like, people are now questioning the intelligence agencies. They're questioning the law enforcement, how law enforcement is carried out, and they are questioning the Federal Reserve and all of that. So it's like very interesting how this thing sort of like continues on, it
Yeah.
spirals, and like you mentioned, and rather I would hear it from you. What do we need to do to uh, replace that sacrificial foundation that lies at the heart of our culture with something that won't crumble?
Mhm.
In other words, is it possible to have a culture that is going to last?
Mhm. Yeah. Well, I mean, because that's what they say is that if we follow Jesus, that, like if we applied Jesus to politics and the way it actually seems to be the way he lived his life, then we would be destroyed by foreign powers. But that's the same thing that Jesus' own audience was concerned about when they were listening to him too, because they kept saying, if we follow your way, we're going to get destroyed by Rome. Even Caiaphas said that it is better that one man die than the whole nation perish. And he knew that his disruption of the hierarchies of difference, lepers here, poor is there, tax collectors there, lame is there, blind is there, this kind of separation of things, that if he was disrupting that could create an opportunity for, in his mind, Caiaphas believed, for Rome to destroy them. So people in Jesus' time were worried about the same thing that we're worried about in following Jesus. So Jesus said, trust in me, trust in my way, and that is how you thrive. And then people around him in his time said, no, we can't do that. We want the Barabbas Jesus. Peter wanted a Barabbas Jesus, which was the son of the father that was the father of lies, which is the spirit of the crowd, which is the spirit of vengeance and revolt and taking back that which is yours. That's the spirit that tends to dominate history, and it's constantly expelling attempts for the true logos to come in and to disrupt that, because those who claim to follow Christ don't quite have enough trust to actually live out his way and to stop reciprocating the aggression back at them because they're afraid they'll be destroyed. But if you don't fear death, then you wouldn't be afraid of being destroyed, and then you would fearlessly embrace nonviolence in its creative capacity and create the achievements necessary to render the logic of the kind of violent brutality of power that people complain about today null. Like we don't do crucifixions anymore because of Jesus. We don't do certain levels of, like, so other types of violence, like things happening to kids in this new experiment that they're doing with gender, that will go away too if you embrace the nonviolent way of Christ to overcome these things. But nobody trusts that, so we got to go through the long, hard, arduous process of reciprocal power struggles and things like that. You can see that all through the Bible. I found a few passages that indicate things like cornerstone. You asked about immurement, which is the practice of pushing someone into a foundation of a new building or a new city, a new town, a new wall, a new temple, a new bridge. All over the world, they do this. They did this all over the
So
world.
they did this even in ancient Israel?
Yeah, well, here's a passage from 1 Kings 16, verse 33. This is then he set up, this is referring to King Ahab. Then he set up an Asherah pole. Thus Ahab did more to provoke the Lord, the God of Israel, to anger than all the kings of Israel before him. That pole is a pagan practice associated with sacrifice. In Ahab's days, Hiel the Bethelite rebuilt Jericho. At the cost of Abiram, his firstborn, he laid its foundation. and at the cost of Segub, his youngest, he set up its gates. That's foundation cornerstone sacrifices, according to the word that the Lord had spoken through Joshua, son of Nun. So here we have them practicing cornerstone ritual sacrifices well after they were told not to. You see this, King Manasseh placed an Asherah pole in the holy temple, according to 2 Kings 21:7. And that's you can look up Asherah pole Wikipedia to see that reference right there, to see what they look like and that reference to that passage. You can see on as late as in this same Wikipedia article, King Josiah's reforms in the late 7th century BC included the destruction of many Asherah poles, this Canaanite deity that was associated with sacrifice. That reference that they're talking about in Joshua goes back to the book of Joshua, chapter 6, talking about the fall of Jericho. They destroyed the city founded on human sacrifice. And then at the end of it, Joshua laid an oath on them in verse 26, chapter 6, verse 26. Joshua laid an oath on them at that time, saying, "Cursed before the Lord be the man who rises up and rebuilds this city, Jericho. At the cost of his firstborn shall he lay its foundation, and at the cost of his youngest son shall he set up its gates." So the Lord was with Joshua, and his fame was in all the land. So the knowledge of the Lord that fills the earth as the ocean is wet, that Jesus is referring to when he comes into Jerusalem and says that when they are silent, the crowd that's singing his name, the stones will cry out. It has to do with the knowledge of the Lord that made Joshua famous in his land, that, to be renowned in his land, that there's this radical critique of sacrifice, including immurement sacrifice, cornerstone ritual sacrifices taking place within the prophetic tradition as early as, an example like Joshua, or even before that with the story of Cain and Abel. But you notice that it's considered a curse in the Joshua text. It's a curse to found your city on a human sacrifice like your firstborn, whereas the ancient world around at the time was not indicating that as a curse, but rather the blessing. So how radical and progressive the text is in that way, that it's calling that which is considered a blessing all around that community and all around the world. At the same time, they're saying, no, that's a curse to do that. And then it's recalled again later on that they're not learning that lesson, and they keep falling back over and over again into this type of cornerstone ritual sacrifice, which is just a symptom of a broader sacrificial mindset that creates ethno-narcissism, ethno-nationalism, all this stuff that we're still dealing with around the world to this day. And Jesus is saying that way doesn't work. This is very practical political critique. If you read it, it's pretty clear that these cornerstone sacrifices are symbolic of a mindset of sacrifice that starts the city. And so when Jesus says the stones will cry out, he's referring to Habakkuk, who's also critiquing a wicked king who's engaging in immurement type sacrifices, amongst a whole host of other types of sacrificial logic. So when we get to the time of the Romans, when they're contesting and they're dealing with the early church, and we'd partake in the Eucharist, that was a kind of satirical challenge to the heart of Rome. That Rome thought it was so sophisticated, because that's what you hear a lot from folks who say, oh, we don't need Christianity. That didn't build the West. It was Rome and its grandeur. That's what made us so powerful in the West. It was the inheritance of the pagan Romans that they gave us that. But what Christianity is doing is something even radical and disruptive to that, because they're saying, okay, you guys say that you're so sophisticated in comparison to the pagan tribes that you're cleaning up on the outskirts of your empire, because they do more brutal forms of, sacrifice, like the Vikings doing the horrible blood eagle sacrifice where they're ripping rib open while the human's alive. It's pretty brutal. Ripping the ribs open to make them spread out like the eagle's wings. That's what you get, that blood eagle sacrifice. Is horrific. And the Romans, they just like our wannabe Romans today, pride themselves in their reason and their capability of might makes right in a very sophisticated way. We're very proud of the fact that they weren't engaged in that type of human sacrifice. But by Christians partaking of this kind of secret devouring of a body behind closed doors, only Christians could participate in it at the time and see it. There's a kind of satire going on against the might and the power and the logic of the Roman Empire, because they're having their reality of their sublimated forms of sacrificial violence and human sacrifice revealed by this return, this apparent return of a rumored human sacrifice taking place. What an affront. Who is this? What in the world? They're nonviolent. Are they? I'm hearing they're eating their God in the back room, but it's blood and wine when I hear more about it. What is going on here? Which is an affront to the sophistication. It reveals it takes away the veneer of all the different sublimated forms of sacrifice. Crucifixions were not considered to be ritual human sacrifices as the Romans would conceive of it, right? They wouldn't see crucifying a criminal as, oh, we're propitiating the gods. They would say this is stamping out disorder, and we're sending us a message. This is a type of crime and punishment. This isn't meant to be in the same view of what the Aztecs would do when they're ripping out a heart around the world at the same time, right? So they think they've transcended that need. But the Christian story and the Christian community engaging in Rome at the time is going to open up a mirror and let them see, wait a second, in reality, all these other forms, whether it's raping your slaves like Roman aristocrats were doing, whether it's brutal treatment of animals, or whether it's wars of savage conquests, whether it's crucifixions, publicly whipping and beating somebody for talking to somebody outside of their rank, whether it's table fellowship where the elites have a certain place to recline at table and the poor don't. All these things are just really sublimated forms of the mimetic desire behind ritual cannibalism, which is a desire to consume the other and a desire to devour the other as a means of creating release and fulfillment in one's psychological and social state.
Yeah, it's very interesting because from what you have said, it's like there's a science to you. There still is a science to human sacrifice. So whenever we would talk with our Christian buddies, at church, and talk with our pastor about these human sacrifices and these immurement sacrifices, these cornerstone sacrifices, when they were going on in the ancient in the time of the ancient Israelites. Even Christians, would treat it as like some kind of like a bizarre, mystery thing. Like it's like a big other, like a phenomenon. Like if you watch some of these esoteric, channels, they would say, oh, they were doing these kind of magical things like Indiana Jones, like the Temple of Doom scene, where it was like Kali Ma Shakti there, that kind of thing, like weird, bizarre thing. But the Bible shows us, like you said, like there's a science to human sacrifice, and our our inability to dive deep into what makes that technology work, that human sacrificial technology, that scapegoating, lynching, expelling the victim, what makes that technology work, and why is it so effective. But also, like Jesus says, why it is bound to end in disaster, why it is bound to fall, whether sooner or later. So the, when you hear Christians and radical right wing, or whatever you want to call them, Christian nationalists, when you hear them, like, okay, like boycotting, what was that, Chick-fil-A or Target, I don't know, like what's the latest retail uh, that's supposed to be boycotted. Like boycotting those things are okay, but sooner or later you'll have to take back power, right? So what are they talking about there? So what are they talking about? That's very interesting. And how do we tie that from what we have observed? How do we tie that with all of these, like all of the ancient societies? They believed in might makes right. They believed in like this Nietzschean sentiment of, this Nietzschean idea of like, just subdue your enemy, and just hammer them down, just grind them into the earth, and in that you'll have victory, and in that only you'll be able to have a prosperous society, or whatever. So what are they really asking? I think they're asking for a return to that sacrificial mechanism, that return to that way of doing human sacrifice. And even though they are Christians or conservatives, even though they have that knowledge of Jesus's crucifixion, they still want that return to that ancient way of subduing your enemies through sheer might, and holding public lynchings, making an example, quote unquote, to of your enemies. Why do they want that? Why are they asking for us to return to that way of life? They're asking it because they are still not willing to dive deep into this science of human sacrifice. They are not willing to answer, they are not willing to understand what the Bible is teaching. And what the Bible is teaching is basically, he has taken this group of people, these ancient Israelites, and he is teaching them, even though they are continuously falling, like you said, they are continuously aping the sacrificial rituals of their neighboring countries, their neighboring pagan countries. They are, the God is still giving them chance after chance after chance, again and again, to see how you can build a foundation without human sacrifice, without the need to scapegoat people. So I think that's a very important, noteworthy thing in my book.
Yeah, like how do you function without having human sacrifice or sacrificial mindset of coercion founding every aspect of your civilization, right?
Yeah, and I think that's very important, and that is part of God's, how God had prepared the nation of Israel for the coming Messiah, that was Jesus Christ. Because you have all of these events of like bloodshed, violence, and all of that, and that is a perfect, I think, reference point for Jesus to draw his teachings off of.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we can do that with an example I wanted to do. I'm pulling it up right now of King David and Goliath in comparison to Jesus. And there's that passage that I've referenced a lot about, who will cast the first stone. So let's pull that up, and we're going to look at that, and we're gonna see if there's any parallel between King David, who is this kingly type of Jesus, an imperfect type because he's not Jesus, right? And then the completion of his dynastic vision in a way that even King David couldn't fully understand because he was locked in a prism of might makes right, transitioning away from human sacrifice and towards something that Jesus would fully realize, but it was still out of his grasp. And but if you look at this, let's look at John chapter 8, just to kind of set the text up a little bit in contrast. So it's a story of teacher, this woman has been caught in the act of adultery. Now, in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. So what do you say? This they said to test him, that they might have some charge to bring against him. Jesus bent down and wrote with his finger on the ground. And as they continued to ask him, he stood up and said to them, let him who is without sin among you be the first to throw a stone at her. And once more he bent down and wrote on the ground. But when they heard it, they went away one by one, beginning with the older ones, and Jesus was left alone with the woman standing before him. Jesus stood and said to her, Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you? She said, No one, Lord. And Jesus said, Neither do I condemn you. Go, and from now on sin no more. Now, I would suggest for all the tough guys out there that want to have a big incarceration state for fentanyl, which again is a problem, and I think if China's pushing that over, like I've heard it alleged, then there should be ways to stop that. But this idea that that's the answer, we just need to get tougher and tougher, and that just means longer and longer prison sentences in a very disgusting situation, which is a kind of welfareism state, the prison state. But somehow that's now tough. See, that's the thing. These neo-reactionaries are very liberal. They're they accept very liberal frameworks for their toughness. But when you look at this, I would say that adultery is way more toxic to a community than any drug use has ever been. Okay, adultery is the foundation by which you create undifferentiation between what is family and what is mob, what is child, what is adult, right? All these things are mediated by this covenant of marriage with fidelity in mind. And the idea of like not punishing that seems insane, right? To a mind that is completely within the framework of a traditionalist reactionary approach to order and integrity. And yet Jesus doesn't punish her in that way. Jesus does not use coercion to transform her heart. So this is why Christians don't want to follow Jesus, because they're terrified of his way. He said, trust in me, and that's how you'll move mountains, and that's how you'll change the world, and that's how you'll baptize a nation. And yet we don't fully trust him because we're said, well, I can't allow the drugs to trade because it'll poison the community and we'll all go high and everybody be destroyed. I would say that adultery is a more disruptive transgression than any drug use, really at its core, because drug use and drug addiction is usually fueled by destruction in the civilization already, right? Broken families, loss of prosperity and wealth in a community is what creates the alienation that is the fuel for drug abuse, right? Trying to numb out and nihilism. Hold on. Trying to numb out and nihilism, trying to numb out from the alienation, the social disintegration of society is usually there first before the drug addiction starts to take hold and become a rampant trade for profit. So I would say that this adultery that this woman is accused of is a greater, threat to stable civilization, and yet Jesus doesn't use violence to deal with it, and he stops it. He saves the woman from the crowd in its righteous indignation. And he does so by drawing attention to the first stone. Let him who is without sin among you be the first to throw a stone at her. Now, the first stone, as Rene Girard points out, is the hardest stone to throw because it's without a model. It's always hardest to be the first person to have a buzz cut when everybody else has long hair, or to have long hair when everybody else has a buzz cut, right? It's always better. It's always hardest to be the one who said, I like Star Wars before anybody else said it. Everybody always wants to claim to be the one that said that, or whatever it is they like. I like punk rock before you like punk rock. I liked Ninja Turtles before you did. I liked whatever. I like this. I like that. I like strong nationalistic politics before you did, or whatever. All these little things that they feel will give them special status in the new club that they want to be part of. They want to claim original status, but it's often the hardest thing to do because it's
they want to
model.
get the wooden spoon.
Yeah, the wooden spoon. And so when you see that first stone, I thought, that to me is an echo of Jesus's ancestor in the story of King David with the story of the Goliath story. So when you look at that story, David, this is in 1 Samuel. Chapter 17, David has got this contest. There's this Goliath out there. He says, David, who was talking to the men standing around him, asked, What's in it for the man who kills that Philistine and gets rid of this ugly blot on Israel's honor? Who does he think he is anyway? This uncircumcised Philistine taunting the armies of God alive. He goes on to say, Saul, I'm just going through the story. Saul answered David, you can't go and fight this Philistine. You're too young and inexperienced. And he's been at this fighting business since you were before you were born. Goes on into the battle scene. David answered, okay, the Philistine ridiculed David, am I a dog that you come after me with a stick? And he cursed him by his gods. And that's because David had taken 5 smooth stones from the brook, put them in the pocket of his shepherd's pack, and he had a sling, right? So that's the famous story. And then David answered, you come at me with sword and spear and battle axe. I come at you in the name of God of the angel armies, the God of Israel's troops, whom you cursed and mocked this very day. God is handing you over to me. I'm about to kill you, cut off your head, and serve up your body and the bodies of your Philistine buddies. To the crows and coyotes, the whole earth will know that there's an extraordinary God in Israel, and everyone gathered here will learn that God doesn't save by means of sword and spear. Battle belongs to God. He's handing you to us on a platter. That roused the Philistine, and he started toward David. David took off from the front line, running toward the Philistine. David reached into his pocket for a stone, slung it, and hit the Philistine hard in the forehead. Embedding the stone deeply, the Philistine crashed face down in the dirt. That's how David beat the Philistine, with a sling and a stone. He hit him and killed him. No sword for David. So Jesus in John chapter 8 talks about the first stone, and King David kills him with the first stone, right? So adultery is a Goliath. Adultery is a Goliath that, in their mind, could contaminate and destroy the people of their time in the gospel story. And then Goliath is an actual Goliath. He's a Philistine in a culture that is embracing human sacrifice. And he's mocking the kind of weakness of this story, of this kingdom of Israel, which is pulling away from human sacrifice and condemning child sacrifice, right? And so that's considered weak. And so David is this young guy that looks weak. He doesn't have a sword. He has a stone, right? So there's this, in the text, you have this story of no sword needed to kill, no sword is needed. No sword is needed, right? There was no sword in the hand of David, right? So there's this theme of might makes right in its fullness, not fully realized by the people of God. They're realizing that, wait a second, you don't need to have a sword. You don't need to use the traditional means of subduing one's enemy in order to be protected by God, to be in a society that thrives. So it's a kind of transitionary fossil text away from the human sacrifice that Goliath's society is completely enthralled in. King David's society is moving away from that logic. It's still wrapped up in that logic because it's still, using ethno-nationalistic framework to say we're going to kill this Philistine and we're going to subdue him, but we're going to do it in kind of a might makes right challenge, because it's not the one who is the mightiest with the sword. It's the one with the stone, right? It's the one who initiates. And I think John is alluding to that stone. The stone motif is in everything. The first stone is the stone of sacrifice in the sense of the cornerstone burial ceremony that Israel is coming away from, but still falling back into in different ways. And then you have the first stone of Jesus stopping the first stone, killing the woman caught in adultery. That little stone is the first stone that initiates her death, which is kind of a type of the cornerstone ritual burial of primordial victims of human society around the world. The Philistines are enraptured in a culture that's fully enmeshed in that human sacrificial cornerstone burial framework. Israel is coming out of it in fits and starts. That's why King David's got part of the gospel, but not its fullness. We're moving away from swords, and now we're down to little tiny stones, which is a way of saying don't trust in the sword. Those who live by the sword die by the sword. Trust in God to provide for you, which is not full nonviolence in that part, because at the time that text is being disseminated, the humans haven't fully grasped where society is going. It's a transition. So they're not ready. They're not, I mean, in some sense, humans were always ready, but they continually create their own, frameworks of society and nationhood and violence and the order of such things. And Goliaths are considered in that framework to be bigger than David's, little guys with little stones. And so this text is satirizing that framework of empire and nationhood and nationalism. But it's not a full repudiation. But it is interesting to note, and I haven't fully fleshed this out. I just saw it while we were talking, actually. But there's interesting to note, 2 Samuel, the next book over, you get this story of Shimei. And it talks about, and this is in chapter 16, as King David approached Bahurim, a man from the same clan as Saul's family came out from there. His name was Shimei, son of Gerah, and he cursed as he came out. He pelted David and all the king's officials with stones, but all the troops and the special guard were on David's right and left. As he cursed, Shimei said, get out, you murderer, you scoundrel. The Lord has repaid you for all the blood you shed in the household of Saul, in whose place you have reigned. The Lord has given the kingdom into your hands, into the hands of your son Absalom. And you have come to ruin because you are a murderer. And then Abishai, son of Zeruiah, said to the king, why should this dead dog curse me? Curse my lord the king. Let me go over and cut off his head. You see these allusions to the Goliath story? The cutting off of the head of Goliath, the calling of the dog, using the reference of dog. And here come the stones pelting right back at David. So you get this kind of, in my opinion, a wink in the text that what goes around comes around, still in that imperfect prism of stones flying this way and that way. You know what I mean? Stone. He makes his name by getting a stone lodged into the head of a Goliath. And now somebody's throwing stones back at him later on to show that these things are not fully done away with in this imperfect move away from violence, right? Violence begets violence. Mimetic reciprocity is coming in as long as you continue to use violence, even if it's not in the same might makes right fullness of a human sacrificial enclosed society like Goliath with a sword in hand. You see what I mean? It's a satire, it's a transition, but it's not fully complete. Jesus fully completes that stone thing, right? Because Jesus doesn't throw a stone at the adulterous woman. He saves the woman enveloped in this in a Goliath society shattering sin of adultery. He saves him. He saves her from being killed by people who would have read King David's story with all zeal in tow, that this gives them some kind of edifice to stand on in stoning this woman who challenges the purity of the very people that King David was protecting when he fought against the Goliath. Now Jesus is kind of in a subversive way coming in and saying, no, we're not doing that stone. And it's actually the stone being dropped by the oldest and wisest and mimetically most desirable to imitate in the crowd that initiates the completion of this stone process, right? That Jesus is going to further complete by embracing the cornerstone and capstone motifs.
Wow, that's so interesting. So basically what you said is like the Jews of Jesus's time, they had a tendency to hallucinate the adulteress or whoever, like the deviant, the delinquent, as a kind of Goliath. And Jesus basically put an end to that hallucination, because his method of disarming people is a much more effective and much more complete thing that in the Bible. That's why he's like saying it is finished on the cross. And and the stone motifs, like the slinging of the stone, like used a slingshot at Goliath. David used stones to kill Goliath. And here the people of Jesus's time, they were about to cast a stone to create a Goliath that they were hallucinating, that they were imagining in this helpless woman, right? And Jesus put an end to that. And I think it reveals a lot that the older people were the first to drop their stones, because the older people are less susceptible to these idealism, or less susceptible to imagining themselves as David's, fighting
Exactly.
Goliath. Yeah, so that's such an interesting thing. I get the Bible is basically like anthropology, one-on-one breaking down, all of
Yeah.
these. And Jesus is even like he's even taking an hammer to the way, like many Christians or many people, they tend to use symbology to justify violence, right? Like imagine your enemy is like Goliath, and like like your enemy is a symbol stand-in for Goliath, and Jesus is taking a hammer to that kind of thinking as well here. So it's so interesting. But the thing is, like, what I wanted to, I mean, do you have anything more to add? Like, I would really want to ask another question, but if you want to add something more, like
Well,
I'm
I
all.
just love that passage at the very end of that Samuel, 1 Samuel 17, and it says, "So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him. There was no sword in the hand of David." I love that, because again, that's going
Yeah,
to tie into David's descendant, Jesus, who says, "Those who live by the sword die by the sword," right? And he's going further than David, because he's going to complete that stone motif in the rejection of the stone, in the mimetic contagion of the nonviolent refusal to stone the woman. He completes that shadow of his coming from that story earlier. And I think it's interesting to note the parallel in 2 Samuel, where David is being pelted with stones too, which is, I think, is meant to, there's meant to be humor there, or some kind of, wry kind of what goes around comes around, because David was caught up in the matrix of power and might makes right, even as he was trying to push further beyond other kingdoms of the world, which were completely locked in that matrix with swords and giants in tow. He's got a little bit of that underdog kingdom developing in his time, right? And he's got a little bit of that underdog kingdom in the sense of trying to not go along with, overt forms of human sacrifice, as he was battling against with the Philistines and others. But he's still not fully there yet. And Jesus completes that. And that stone motif is littered through the entire text in so many different ways. We could go on and on and on, and we'll try to unpack it as much as we can over the course of probably more broadcasts and stuff. But just to kind of think about it, I mean, even the stone that covers Jesus' tomb, right? That's rolled away, just like the stone.
there's a lot of stone masonry going on there
Yeah.
in the symbols.
Yeah, the stones rolled away, and they're terrified because, that's the end of the death cult of the world, right? And that's the beginning of the resurrection cult. I mean, or the resurrection New World Order, right? And this idea of the stone being rolled away, that, is so heavy, it would be very difficult for humans to have moved it in a very easy way, which kind of gives you the indication that only God could end the stone cornerstone. Because think about the tomb of Jesus as a kind of type to the cornerstone ritual sacrifice, right? There's a stone here, covering up a person unjustly murdered for the propitiation of the community's guilt. Now we have it as a tomb. Now it's not in the same way. Joseph of Arimathea is giving this tomb to Jesus but it's certainly after a kind of scapegoat murder took place. But just like the text says that the stones emptied and people were being visited by the heroes and saints and prophets of old, you know, that includes everybody. That includes all nations that have been saturated with the gospel infection since that time, as people go back in Japan even and kind of reevaluate how did they treat indigenous people, and people in Germany reevaluate how they have fallen into ethno-nationalism, of course, right? So all these different places around the world are being infected with this this awareness of the ways in which they have benefited from the lie of cornerstone ritual sacrifice in all of its forms and fashions. And then they have an opportunity to kind of imagine a world in which they can get along without using the initiation of violence or vengeance to get on with life. There's still a place for defensive force. That's not pacifism we're talking about. We're talking about there is a place for defensive force, but there isn't a place for vengeance or the initiation of violence to solve problems. Our society right now is crumbling precisely because the edifices, the structures of our, think of them as pillars. Our education pillar is founded on violent sacrifice and coercion. Our money system, Federal Reserve System, is founded on violent monopoly. I get to have one type of money and that's it, and it's enforced by law, and it's counterfeit, and it's debased, and it's printed out of thin air, and they get to fix the price of money, which sets the price of interest, and all these different things that are all coercive, and that's our money. Then you've got commerce with regulations and corporate welfare and rigged trade deals that displace nations and destroy nations with all these rigged corporate oligarchic chicanery going on in the guise of free trade, when it's not free, it's managed trade. When you have something like energy being mediated by all these oligarchic chicanery, you know, with controlling energy and making it artificially limited, and having wars and sanctions to fight over different access to different currencies connected to different energy, currencies attached to different energy pipelines and markets. I'm thinking of OPEC in America. I'm thinking of what's going on with other rival factions in that regard. That's violent sacrifice-based energy. That's violent sacrifice-based education. You can't have your money taken out of the pot that government takes to fund government schooling. That's taken by force. If you resist, you will be shot eventually. So that's a sacrificial, violent, coercion-based education system, sacrificial, violent-based energy system, sacrificially violent-based commerce system, and so on and so forth, right? And so when you have all of those foundations with hidden victims, either preemptively, because it's not just the hidden victims that happen to enforce those monopolies, it's also the fact that it's preemptively saying, if you dare challenge us, you will be victimized. So that's a kind of victimization taking place too, right? Because people don't challenge these monopolies because they'll be mowed down. So there's violence in that potentiality for grinding up more victims that challenge these systems. But every one of those things feed into the disarray and disorder and chaos that we're now experiencing right now, right? And so because we don't trust in Jesus' way, because we don't have nonviolent options for funding education, not this little, these little token school choice bills are just little tiny slivers of what real Christian honoring, Christ honoring education systems would look like, where you don't have property taxes funding education. You have a completely nonviolent, completely voluntary system in place for education. When you have that for money, when you have that for commerce, when you have that for energy, too cheap to meter, when you have that for healthcare, when you have that for food, when government isn't subsidizing toxic seed oils, you don't get 100 years of chronic diseases blowing up around the world. So whenever we disobey Jesus's order of nonviolence with a shortcut to heaven that leads to hell, which is coercive monopolies, it creates all this downstream disease, disintegration, gender confusion. All of these things are the product of founding our society on these frameworks of the sword instead of the refusal of the sword, of the stone instead of the healing of the cornerstone sacrifice. You see? And that's the whole point of the gospel message. It is political. And I just gave you the political consequences of it.
That's so interesting. And but again, like people will say, like, what you basically did was you unraveled how everything around us, our economic system, our political system, the way we do medicine, how everything around us is basically found on violence, is basically found on coercion, is basically found on subduing like non-violent people, like and just in order to just socially engineer them into, like, following every order like mice. You have uncovered everything, and there's no going back. You're what you're basically saying. But the thing is, like, people don't know how deep this goes. So when people say, okay, like, this is such an esoteric knowledge, oh wow, we're going to put it into our pockets, and we're just going to keep on voting for the same leaders who's going to continue the same thing, the foreign wars, the bailing out of the bankers and all of that, just disaster upon disaster. And how, like, of course you let us know what the consequences are, but is there a way to build a non-violent system? Like, our, like, people will say, like, we have not reached that level of maturity, or like, we have not reached that level of they will keep coming back to that David versus Goliath story, and they will keep cherry picking that, but they will not mature. But in spite of our tendency towards violence, in spite of all of that, and I think I already know the answer to this. You have explained this many times in many broadcasts, but I, just to, kind of like, as we land the plane here, uh how do we proceed forward? What's the proper way to, apply this revelation in our current day society?
Well, you have the you have you have to understand that we're talking about the revelation of how societies functioned in the past on hidden victims, how Jesus exposes the the limited capacity of what such societies can produce.
Aren't the left sort of doing that in some ways, when they bring up the slavery of Thomas, the slavery that was associated with Thomas Jefferson, or say any of the
But they
other
don't. But
founding
no, but they
fathers?
don't. Basically, they don't, because they glorify the violence of slavery by saying it was much more effective than it actually was. See? So that's Jesus's critique, is to say slavery actually was an inefficient means, because it was a kind of sacrificially laden, sacrificially violent. Again, institutions are not doing traditional Aztec level human sacrifice at that stage when you're talking about American slavery, but it's still a sacrificial, violent system. It's sublimated into some kind of excuse called slavery, right? This heinous thing. And why is it bad? It's bad because Jesus Christ came to liberate all human beings, and that might does not determine right to own someone or do anything like that. And then what the point is also, there's a utility to understanding the frivolity of violence, because violent based systems are not as innovative and prosperous and wealthy compared to non-violent alternatives. Okay, so when you burn witches to solve a plague, that society will not be as prosperous as a society that figures out how to wash your hands and not have the disease spread to you. And so it's not just that it's wrong in and of itself to harm God's children in brutal ways, but it's also, especially in light of societies that are starting to get rid of some of those practices of sacrifice, it's actually going to doom your society, because the sacrificial violence doesn't unite the people. The Civil War literally was split up. The story was in contest of this type of sacrificial violence. It ripped them apart. The story of this horrible thing ripped the nations apart. The nations was torn apart, right? And so in the same way, societies that continue to use other forms of violence, like wars, to get their energy, will fall apart, like we see happening in America and other places. What we see happening in nations that use violent monopolies to create education, their education will continue to spiral into madness. And nations that continue to stomp out competitions to fiat currency, those nations will continue to spiral into debt, enslavement, and madness. Nations that continue to mediate science through the prism of monopoly coercion will continue to create less effective solutions for diseases that are more and more expensive, that don't do anything, that create side effects and create sick people. So they will extinguish themselves. All of these bad practices will extinguish themselves on the face of the earth, because they don't result in life. They don't result in flourishing. When you lie and say, no, I don't want God's nonviolent way, I want what the government violently imposes on me, you'll keep eating your seed oils and you'll keep getting sick, and your society will get sick to the point where it extinguishes itself from the earth. If you continue to double down on wars and war-based energy systems, you'll extinguish yourself with endless fighting, like what we see happening around the world right now. If you continue to double down on violence-based monopolies of education, your people will not be as educated as societies that move slightly away from those things and start innovating and being more nimble and more creative in how they think and how they process. Look at this passage I found from a text. I don't know the name of it. Somebody sent a link to it. I've read it before. It's called Foundations Laid in Human Sacrifice. But I found an excerpt from it. It says, some archaeologists believe that the idea of burying alive is due to the notion, this is talking about immurement sacrifices, cornerstone ritual sacrifices, believe that the idea of burying alive is due to the notion that the forces of nature, be they gods, demons, or giants, and later in their stead, the devil. By the way, behold, I see Satan fall like lightning. What was considered to be of the gods is now considered to be of the devil by everybody's imagination, to lay a burial of a human being.
Yeah,
sacrifice.
Zeus was a god of lightning, and now Satan has been associated with lightning in the New Testament.
Yeah, interesting too. Yeah, but this idea of, I just want to clarify to make sure my point. Forces of nature, gods, giants, whatever. Later, it's just the devil, because only a devil would make you put a human being alive in a tomb or of a wall, right? They were supposed to, so it says the gods, demons, giants, and later in their stead the devil were supposed to possess the privilege of collecting rent from mankind. The spirit of the soil was supposed to be the landlord, to whom payment was to be made by an offering of human life. This is from the Grimm mythology book. Frequently, it was regarded as necessary to entomb within the foundation of a building living creatures and even men, an act which was regarded as a sacrifice to the soil, which had to endure the weight of the structure. By this cruel custom, people hoped to attain permanence and stability for great buildings. Just think about this for a second here. That the soil, the land, collects rent by offering human life as a payment. That's what we see today with this global warming cult, by the way, right? We have to destroy all cheap forms of energy, because that's going to end up sacrificing millions of people. They're killing cows in Ireland right now. So people are going to starve. People are going to be more unhealthy, and that's going to sacrifice a lot of people in the long run. And they're doing that to collect rent to the gods of the earth. But the gods of the earth are really just sick oligarchs who are just coming up with another creative way to consolidate their monopolies over energy. And so they do it in the name of victims by trotting out people like the young girl to hide behind the victim cloak that they have to do to even remain somewhat competitive with Jesus's kingdom, but they're not competitive. Just looks like that. But they're operating under his framework, and so they have to come in the name of a little Greta to enact these sick immurement sacrifices to the soil, to Mother Earth, now we call it. There are innumerable stories which preserve records of this barbaric custom. And there can be no doubt that many of them are historical and that the practice continued until comparatively recent time. We read in Thiel that the walls of Copenhagen always sank down again and again, although they were constantly rebuilt, until the people took an innocent little girl, placed her on a chair before a table, gave her toys and sweets, and while she merrily played, 12 masons covered the vault and finished the wall, which since that time remained stable. Scutari is said to have been built in a similar way. A ghost appeared while the fortress was in the process of building and demanded that the wife of one of the three kings who should bring the food to the masons on the next day should be entombed in the foundation. Being a young mother, she was permitted to nurse her baby, and a hole was left for that purpose, which was closed as soon as the child was weaned. See, none of these little Nietzsche fanboys want this stuff. They talk like they want it, but they don't know what they're talking about. That's why they're typing away on the keyboard. We read and nobody wants this. That we read in Nork's Citron und Gebranch, I don't know this German word, that when in 1813 the ice broke the dam of the river Elbe and the engineers had great trouble in repairing it, an old man addressed the dike inspector saying, "You will never repair the dike unless you bury in it an innocent little child." And Grimm adduced even a more modern instance, which dates from the year 1843, when the new bridge in Halle was built. Grimm tells us the people talked of a child which should be buried in its foundation. So there's a long-held pagan behaviors that were still being enacted in even in recent times. I know about stories in Japan where they would lay a child as a sacrifice for the building of a new bridge to cover a raging river that they were afraid needed to have some kind of appeasement, right? And so this is something that Christians should be opposed against, but they shouldn't oppose it with sacrificial alternatives. They should self-sacrifice their fear of being considered weird or whatever they're afraid of. Just like Peter was afraid of letting Jesus follow the way of the cross, right? He was afraid of something, and we need to self-sacrifice that fear of the crowd and fear of tyranny, like Peter was wrestling with, who was named the Rock.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting because that one time humanity, like Girard said, we we discovered science because we stopped burning witches. So basically, like, we found out that burning witches aren't going to make our harvest come closer. It's not going to make our crops better, or it's not going to take away the diseases and all of that. So we started finding, we started getting to the actual root cause of the problems, and that's what accelerated the scientific revolution that we have seen up until this point. But what happened is, like, we forgot the fact that it was forsaking sacrificial violence that made us able to achieve scientific advances and all of that. We forgot that, and we clung on to the outcome. We held on to the scientific advancements, and we thought that, wow, we must have been such geniuses to have discovered this, but we forgot the way we discovered it. That's the thing. And I think, like, if we start doing that again, if we start looking to other ways, in doing money, other non-coercive, non-violent ways of doing education, will be surprised, at the things we might discover.
Yeah, I mean the whole world is open to a society that can understand where its sacrificial blind spots are, and then not freak out about it, but wean completely off of it as completely fast as possible. and and that's a very hard thing because they don't, like, nobody, even in the school choice movement, they don't really refer to education as founded on violence, right? Because we don't want to use those words. We want to hide our eyes from the reality of what we're actually saying in our society. When we say, you pay this that goes to this service that you don't believe in, you don't like the way they teach economics, you don't like the way they teach biology, you don't like anything they teach, but you are forced by threat of violence to have your life taken from you eventually if you don't comply to fund this education. When you have that kind of thing, it's going to create awful, awful outcomes. And then when you have that, and then you have a sacrificial violence way of taking care of the elderly, like Social Security is. So then that disconnects the family from their elders. Now there's a disconnect between the good lessons of the elders going on to the grandchildren, right? And then when they're fed toxic seed oils, which are violently sacrificed by stealing from the people to subsidize these monocrops that go into these sludge products, that makes more problems, more suffering, more agony, more bitterness. Children grow up with bitterness. Now they want to have a ideology for vengeance, or they have gender dysphoria because of hormone disruptions from eating these toxic foods. So you see all these multiple tributaries of a river of evil, but we don't want to acknowledge that it's that simple to just say no to that stuff. Well, no, we don't want it. We need to have government schooling, and we need to have government energy, and we need to have government subsidies of soy because that would disrupt those farmers that are dependent on it. So we trust in the way of man and not the way of God, and we continue to slide down in our destruction. But it's not that hard. It's not that hard. There will be some creative disruption, and it will be uncomfortable. I mean, it was uncomfortable to go from horse and carriage to car, but it happened.
That's it.
It happened, and it's okay, And yes, people will be put out of jobs that are doing horse and carriage instead of cars, right?
Yeah, I mean, like imagine if what would happen if we stop focusing on who would be the president, if we stop focusing on who we might be able to collectively scapegoat, which political candidate we have to scapegoat. Instead of that, we focused on the root cause, which is the consumption of seed oils. Like, isn't that how isn't that how science was discovered, right? Like, science was discovered, like, when they stopped burning witches, and when we stop burning our modern day witches, when we stop extorting people, coercing people, or, like, wanting to subdue them, and instead focus on, okay, look, you have a gender dysphoria problem, or whatever, autism problem, whatever. Have you looked into giving up seed oils? What's your seed oil consumption, seed oil intake? Like,
And it's not just that. You can't just reduce
well,
all
that's
these to
one
that.
example.
But yeah.
One example, yeah.
But the thing is just like having that kind of creative problem solving approach instead of demonizing, oh, this person looks like this person is a monster. We must battle them, right? So we just battle them. And then the person being battled, says, well, they're a monster for not letting me express my deconstructed gender or whatever. So then, it's just endless back and forth instead of resolving matters that would resolve the grounds by which those errors can flourish. Okay. When you stop wars, that's going to heal some of the fatherlessness. That's going to heal some of the misplaced, the violence being discharged onto the families when they come home, the shame that gets sublimated into bad family structures, which creates brokenness and pain and all the traumas that people in psychology world talk about. All of that stuff can be healed, but you have to stop. right? Like there's families that go through dysfunction because their grandfather was in a noble war like World War II, right? They come back with PTSD. They're very violent and abusive, and then that physical violence goes into the kids, and that creates mental abuse, emotional abuse, physical violence that sometimes spread generations. Instead of looking back and saying, why did we send people to heinous things that would disturb the mind to that degree? We just moved the conversation to, okay, well, you need to have government mandated, healthcare, counseling, or something like that. Instead of like, okay, those are downstream things, but look at the core issue here of that stronghold of broken families and military, and what does the broken minds from unjust military behaviors, actions, and being able to call it for what it is instead of going to churches that don't want to condemn those wars.
Yeah,
Because
I
we
mean,
should be able to even critique World War II, as holy as that war is. There's still ways in which we
well,
can
I
critique
mean,
how that happened and what
imagine,
happened and how they were
imagine,
dealt with.
imagine being that World War veteran who comes back, after having defeated the Nazis,
Mhm.
when he stands for patriotism and all of that in front of politically correct protesters or whatever, and imagine being that person and he's being called a Nazi to his face after just getting back from defeat, not just but after after he saw all of his friends you know die, their limbs get blown off, their bodies get shred to pieces, in brutal wars,
Yeah.
and they're coming back. It's just like it's a real time experience of saying, okay, like all of this sacrifice, it came to nothing. It came to maybe a few years, like a boom period, but after that the fall was even much more harder, so it just proves, even if like World War II, like you said, is held up like such a noble
Yeah.
war in our mythos, but even that has not been able to sustain the world.
Sustainability comes from nonviolent, Christ honoring um, actions that
This is
serve
so
their neighbor.
interesting. This is so interesting because World War II is often being held up as the standard of a just war, right? We went and but even that, did not was not able to create a lasting, rules based world, or a world order. It just came to naught, and it's so true because the only, yeah, you're right, the only way we can be able to build a new world order, quote unquote, is through non-violence.
I mean, you had ethno nationalism battling it out on that war, and in different ways of oligarchic control of resources and nations and how that was to be determined, and it all, to ally with the Soviet Empire and the things they were doing to people, the heinous
I mean,
things they did. I mean, there is no
yeah.
real. It's just very murky the more you look at it, and it doesn't take away from the honorable sacrifice of people laying down their life to save people in harm's way. There's always that abstract and then reality that does have those beautiful stories, but it's overall we're coming to the end of that order that was established in that
I mean, this
cataclysm.
getting it's getting so clear. I mean, it's just to cite a much more recent example, the war on terrorism,
Yeah.
right? Like as George W. Bush was initiating the invasion of Afghanistan. I remember, like, I was very young at that time. I was watching the news, CNN, Fox, and all of that. I remember George W. Bush saying that they hate us for our freedoms, and yet here we are, you know, less freedom than we have ever enjoyed in the entirety of our history, right? Like Patriot Act and all of that, all of it. Like, who's exactly hating us for our freedoms? Like it's almost like our ability to make external enemies is vanishing day by day, and we're turning inside more and more. It's like we're searching for that that non-violent future.
Because when
But
you're depending on sacrifice for difference and sacrifices fail to unite, then you lose differences. And then you become undifferentiated, where you lose sight of what is a child, what is appropriate, what is gender, right? What is all these different things start to become what is an American, what is a border, all these things, all undifferentiation, because the sacrificial violence is not creating a sense of order and differentiation. Iraq was not 100% supported it and believed in it. It was very disruptive and disorganizing to the American conscience. Same with Syria, same with Libya, same with all these other situations. To this day, with this conflict in Ukraine, the nation is divided over whether the saints that we've been told on TV are saints are actually saints and the villains are truly diabolical villains. It's just confusing, and it doesn't create catharsis. It doesn't create a sense of order and meaning that we can then transcend our individual rivalries and pettiness and come together around something. Like, we are this and we're not that. We can't agree on that, because they're trying desperately to. That's why they say, well, we're fighting over there for the flag, the LGBT flag. They say, you know, they're saying that we're supporting Ukraine to fight for that flag. But does that unite the country? No, it unites the part of the country that hangs out with that worldview. So then what do you do with the rest of the country that doesn't get united by that? Well, you have to find a way to sacrifice them. And then that side that doesn't have as much power wants to get back power and sacrifice them. So you get this really ugly situation. It's really, really bad, because it doesn't need to be this way. All you got to do is have churches teach Jesus the way, you know, the anthropological and theological way does. And then you start to see how obvious this essential message of his life really is. Oh, Jerusalem, if you had only known the ways of peace. What are the ways of peace, and what does that have to do with penal substitutionary atonement? What does it have to do with that? I mean, that's just like a totally different conversation. We're talking about totally different things, talking about some kind of juridical model of something that's abstract, and then the ways of peace. See, if you read it the way we're reading it, it just flows. Everything flows smoothly. It makes sense. So it's the common sense view of it, right? You just have to have the courage to read it with the understanding of that motif running through the text. So I think that's a great way to end off, at least in this topic, you know.
Yeah, I mean, we could talk about so many more things, but I guess this has to be it. And really excited to dive much more deeper. And it's like what we have talking about are not really, it's not really dangerous. It's really the last hope we have. Yeah.
Very good. Take care.
All right. You too.